anything we've come across so far. But why should it be easy to prove the existence of God, right? You know, one of my colleagues at Hartford Community College who taught accounting, his students would complain how difficult the course was and how technically involved. And his response to them was, well, look, you ought to be glad it's hard. If this stuff were easy, they wouldn't need you. They wouldn't need to hire you as an accountant. They'd be doing it themselves. And, you know, so, I mean, it's not an easy argument. It is an argument that claims not only to prove God's existence, but to prove God's existence with the certainty of a proof in mathematics, with what we call in logic deductive certainty. Now, a characteristic of that type of an argument, of a deductive argument, is that if the reasons given in support of the conclusion, what we call the premises, are true, then in a deductive argument, the conclusion must be true. In other words, it would be a contradiction to accept the premises and deny the conclusion. And so we have that sort of an argument here, where it is claimed that it will be a contradiction to accept the main premise, which is basically the definition of who God is, and deny the conclusion that God exists. So, again, a contradiction is of the form A and not A, where A is some statement that can be true or false. And a contradiction can never be true. In other words, not in traditional logic. Something of the form A and not A can never be true. So you don't want a contradiction. So basically this argument says, look, either you're going to land in a contradiction, or you're going to accept, along with the premise of who God is, you're going to accept the conclusion that God exists. You know, so a good way to try to understand, and we're going to look at two different versions of this argument, Anselm's original version and a tweaked version that Descartes later got out. But both of them basically are the same type of argument, an argument that goes from the concept of God to the claim that the being that fits the concept must exist. So, in other words, both of these arguments try to say, well, you can't agree with me, say Anselm and Descartes, you can't agree with me on the concept of God and at the same time deny God's existence without falling into a contradiction, without contradicting yourself. So if you accept the definition of who God is, this argument says basically you must, by the conclusion that God exists. So here's the first one. We kind of started this, but we had the weekend and all. We mention that the ontological argument gets its name from the Greek word ontos, for being or existence. And the idea is it moves from a concept about who God is, about the being of God, to a conclusion that the being that fits that concept has to be around. So this is an abstract argument, as we said before, that does not depend, like other arguments, like the design argument, like the argument from first cause. Those arguments depend on looking around at the world, making some observations about things in the world, and then concluding that, from what you can observe in the world, like that things need a cause, or that things show evidence of having been fashioned to serve purposes, from there you can conclude that there must have been a first cause, there must have been a designer. But this argument is totally abstract. It goes from nothing more than the concept of who God is supposed to be. So, let me... So we looked at this before, and you get what seems like a kind of a convoluted definition, but basically what that big phrase at the top comes to is that God is the greatest being we can think of or imagine. God is a being than which none greater can be thought. So Anselm believes then, if he's trying to convince the fool, and we said before, the fool is the denier of God's existence. He's quoting a verse from the Psalms, "A fool has said in his heart, there is no God." What Anselm is going to try to show is that if he can get somebody who denies God's existence to at least agree with him on the concept of God, then he's going to try to show them that if they agree on the concept of God, they can't deny God's existence, because it follows from that concept of God that the being that fits the concept must exist. So we'll see how he does this in a moment. So this is what he hopes to do then, to take somebody who may deny God but at least agrees on the concept of God, to the conclusion that if they agree with him on the concept of God, they must accept the conclusion that God exists. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, no, that in other words, to agree that, well, if God were around, God would be the greatest being we can think of or imagine. See that? In other words, he would be saying something like, well look, I know you don't believe in God, but give me at least this. Wouldn't you think if God were around, God would be the greatest being we could think of or imagine? I mean, what could be greater than God, as God is conceived of? See, that's the way he hopes to get things started. And then he hopes to show from there that, well, if you're going to agree with me on the concept of God, you cannot then go on to deny God's existence without contradicting yourself. Now we need to see how. So, in other words, you're trapped. If you agree with him on the concept of God, if his argument works, then you're either involved in a contradiction or you're basically trapped into concluding that the being that the concept refers to has to be around, has to exist. So how does he get that? Can we deny God's existence? Well, the question that this argument raises then is, can we deny existence to a God who fits the concept that God is the greatest being we can think of, that none greater can be thought? Anselm, again, is going to try to say, no, you can't. If you agree on the concept, you have to agree that God exists. We can't do this, then deny God's existence and agree on the concept without contradicting ourselves. So how does he go about this? Well, built into this is a Platonic assumption about greatness and existence. For Plato, goodness itself, the form of the good, is the greatest, the most morally perfect thing, but also the most fully existing thing. And as things get farther and farther down the line, as you go from lesser forms out of the realm of forms just to objects in this world, or you get even farther away from reality and you're into images of objects, well, for Plato, things go down the scale in existence. So buried in this argument, though he never says so, is basically the Platonic assumption that the greatness of God would be tied up directly with the existence of God, and you can question that tie. That's one way people have responded to this argument before and challenged it. So he illustrates this with a concrete example. This is actually Anselm's own example. But again, he says, well, it's one thing to say that God exists in the mind and the understanding, but not in reality. And he says this is essentially what the denier of God's existence is saying. Okay, well, I'll agree that I can have a concept of God, but God exists only as a concept in my mind, not in reality. That's what the person who denies God's existence is in effect saying. So how's he go from here? Well, he gives us a concrete illustration of the fact, and this is meant to kind of underscore or prove Plato's connection of greatness with existence. He's saying, well, isn't it one thing for a painting to just exist in the mind of a painter, but then another thing entirely for it to exist in reality? And wouldn't the painting that exists in reality be greater than just the painting that exists only as a concept? So he says, don't we see from this then, this is the Platonic claim, that it's greater to exist in reality than only as a concept in the mind. So, if that than which none greater can be thought existed only in the mind, then we could think of a greater. In other words, if you say, well look, God would be that than which none greater can be thought, but I don't believe that God exists in reality. Well, he would say, well, wait a second. If you're saying the God who fits that description doesn't exist in reality, then you're not thinking of the greatest thing you can think of. Because in order basically to qualify as the greatest thing, it has to exist in reality. So if the person who denies God's existence is saying, well, okay, I agree that God is that than which none greater can be thought, but I think God exists only in the mind. And some would say, well, that's not the greatest being you can think of, then. The greatest being you can think of exists in reality as well. So, but by definition, I mean, God is the greatest, God is that than which none greater can be thought. We can think of no greater than that than which. So, in order to qualify, in order to fit the concept of God, the being must exist in reality, or else he wouldn't really be the greatest being we can think of. Do you see the move here? If you talk about that than which none greater can be thought, but say, well, yeah, but what I'm thinking of exists only as a concept in mind, he'd say, well, that doesn't really qualify as the greatest thing you can think of, because it's greater to exist in reality, so the greatest thing you can think of has to exist in reality as well. As a graduate school professor of mine said, and some would say, well, what about the God you're thinking of? Does he exist in reality? And if you say no, you say, well, you don't have that than which none greater can be thought. You need to try again. So, the argument basically, in its conclusion, obviously wants to identify God as God is traditionally conceived in monotheism with the greatest being we can think of. So he says, and God then must exist, if God is that than which none greater can be thought, must exist not only in the mind but in reality as well, or else we could think of a greater. So you would say the fool has to admit then that what is in his mind, the concept of God, as that than which none greater can be thought, exists in reality as well, or you would be contradicting yourself, because if the only way something can qualify as that than which none greater can be thought is if it exists in reality, you'd be contradicting yourself by saying, oh yeah, I think God would be that than which none greater can be thought, but I don't believe God exists in reality. But of course the point of this argument is that buying that initial concept of God guarantees also that you're buying the premise that to qualify as the greatest being you can think of, God has to exist in reality. So you would be basically saying, okay, I believe God is that than which none greater can be thought. That is, you just bought that God exists in reality. But I don't believe that God exists in reality. You'd be contradicting yourself then to buy into the concept and then deny God's existence. So basically, Anselm's argument is meant to, push you into the conclusion that God exists if you agree with him on the concept of God. Now, can anything be said in objection? Well, the classic objection, and this brings up something that I think is interesting. It's one thing to believe in God or not to believe in God, as God is traditionally conceived. It's another thing entirely to agree or disagree that a particular argument really does the job to prove God's existence. In other words, you can believe in God and have a problem with a particular argument that somebody advances that says proves God. And this is essentially the case because Guanillo wasn't an atheist. Guanillo was a fellow monk with Anselm, presumably as devout a believer in God as Anselm, but he didn't think Anselm's proof worked. Now, he uses a technique that we're not going to go into the technical points, but in logic we call this developing a logical analogy. That is, developing an argument that has the same form as the one you're criticizing, but showing that it has a real problem with it. And if your analogical argument has a problem, then that reflects back on the original argument. And this is a technique. Remember, these medieval scholastic philosophers were very careful scholars in logic. He knows what he's doing in using this way of refuting an argument. So what Guanillo says is, you know what, Anselm? I could use the same kind of reasoning that you're using in your ontological argument to prove that the greatest island I can think of, the most perfect island, has to be out there somewhere in reality. And what do you think of that? So he says, by the very same reason we could prove that the greatest island we can think of, I mean, I would imagine some, beautiful tropical paradise. Someplace we wish we were rather than in downtown Baltimore today with 20-degree temperatures, right? But Anselm says, hey, not Anselm, but Guanillo, Anselm's fellow monk, says, look, Anselm, I could go on to reason the same way you're reasoning about God. I could say, well, look, the greatest island I could think of can't exist in the mind only, or it wouldn't be the most perfect or greatest island. In order to qualify as the greatest island, it has to exist not just as a concept in the mind, but out there in reality. So Guanillo says, you know what, by the same reasoning, I could conclude that the most perfect or the greatest island I can think of has to exist in reality and can't exist just as a concept, or it wouldn't qualify as the greatest island. Well, you can see the problem with this. Shouldn't it seem odd that from mere thought alone, from a mere concept, we can develop a proof that says that island must be out there somewhere? And if that seems strange, then he says, well, if it seems odd that we should be able to prove by mere thought alone that such an island must be out there, then doesn't this reflect back on the reasoning used to get at that proof? Isn't it better to question the reasoning that gives you this proof that the most perfect island is out there somewhere? But if the logical analogy is correct, and I think he's pretty much on target here, Anselm did not think so, but you could say this reasoning has also given us the ontological argument for God. So if there's a problem proving that the most perfect island exists from mere thought alone, from the mere concept of the most perfect island or the greatest island we can think of, isn't there also then a problem with the reasoning that uses the same reasoning to prove God's existence as Anselm does. That's essentially Guinilo's objection. Now, what Anselm tried to say was that the case of God is unique. And this is what Descartes picks up on. What he's trying to say is that existence is a necessary concept, is a necessary part of who God is, in a way that it is not a necessary part of the greatest island. Well, you know, at any rate, I've never been very satisfied with that objection. You know, I think Guinillo points up some real problems. But Descartes, we're going to look at Descartes and Descartes' meditations later on, and we're going to see that he uses a bunch of skeptical arguments to show that he can just about doubt everything. And we're going to see that Descartes argues that we could doubt that we have a body or that the world around us is real. And what Descartes is going to try to do is to prove God's existence and that God is no deceiver. And so when I think this is a real table, God would in some sense be deceiving me if he made me such that I think there's a real table in front of me, but there's not. It's just a figment of my mind, or he allows me to be deceived by some kind of malevolent demon or something. And so Descartes is going to try to prove that God exists and God is no deceiver. And one of the ways he does this, first of all, he cannot, we're going to see he can't rely on things like the design argument or the argument from first cause, because those depend on facts about the world. And we're going to see that Descartes at that point is doubting the world. So he's got to use an abstract argument to prove God, and one of the ones he uses, maybe the main one he uses, is the ontological argument, and he kind of tweaks it. And frankly, I think Descartes' version of it, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, is a lot easier to understand than Anselm's. So I say it's the ontological argument restated. Both versions of it are a priori. That is, they make both claim that we can move from the concept of God, the mere concept of who God is, to a claim that the being who fits that concept has to exist. Now, we saw that Anselm works with the concept of God as the greatest being we can think of or imagine. Descartes works with a slightly different concept, but he thinks still fits in with the traditional Judeo-Christian concept of God. Descartes works with the concept of God as the supremely perfect being, that is, the being who has all perfect qualities, right? We saw that, the Greek gods were portrayed as having a lot of human frailties and as being far from perfect, whereas God in traditional monotheism is conceived of as being perfect. So what Descartes is going to try to show is that existence is an essential part of who God is, in just the same way that having three angles and three sides are essential to what a triangle is. In other words, you can't have a triangle without having a plane figure that has three sides and three angles. And he's going to say, well, you can't have God without God's being an existing being. In other words, it's not essential to what a triangle is that it be any particular color, right? That it be, I guess, red or orange, somewhere in between here. That it be red or yellow or black. Those aren't essential properties that a triangle has to have. A triangle doesn't have to be red in order to be a triangle, right? But it does have to have three sides and three angles. And this harkens back to Plato's forms. If we capture the form of something, we capture those qualities that are essential to it. So what he's going to try to convince us of, Descartes is that existence cannot be separated from the essential nature of God, from the essence of God, any more than having three angles equal to two right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle. So we can't even think of God except as existing. In the same way that we can't think of a triangle without thinking of it as having three sides and three angles. So you can say, well, how does Descartes then make existence an absolutely essential property of who and what God is? Like three angles are an essential property of a triangle. Well, this gets back to the concept of God that Descartes works with, that God is the most perfect being. Right? Because God is a supremely perfect being, he's going to try to say that in order to be the being that possesses all perfections, all perfect qualities, that being has to possess existence, because existence is a perfect quality. Now, I know, these arguments are very abstract, but try to, your best to follow along with this. This is, as I said, one reason why I don't give you long reading assignments, because, it's hard to follow extended reasoning. And you may want to go back and review the PowerPoints if it doesn't hit you right away, if you haven't already reviewed them. Here's the way I like to present it, and I had a modern day text that stole this way of using it, but I've been presenting things this way since the 1980s. Suppose we had two competing definitions of God, right? Look at the one on the left here. Suppose we listed what are usually thought of as the traditional perfect qualities of God in monotheism, right? These aren't going to be the properties of some of the Greek gods, but in monotheism, God is thought of as being all-powerful. Even in the Greek systems, Zeus may be the most powerful god, but he's not all-powerful. There's a difference. Omniscience, that means God knows everything. Omnipresence, God is everywhere. It's not that God is in the universe, but that the universe is in God. Omnibenevolence. God is morally perfect and foundation of morality. So you can say, well, what's wrong with that list? Well, Descartes would say, you know what? There's a very important perfection of God that's left out of this list. If we made a second list, we would see exactly what that quality is. Descartes would say, yes, we were right to include all these properties, but if we're going to come out with a description of God as the being that possesses all perfect qualities, we don't want to forget to mention in our description of God that God possesses the perfect quality of existence. So, you can say, well, all right, where do we go from here? How is this supposed to prove that God exists? Well, much in the same way that Anselm wanted to prove that God must be around if God is the greatest being we can think of. This argument tries to show that God must exist, must be around if God is to be the most perfect being we can conceive. Why? Because existence is one of those perfect qualities. So he's going to say you can't buy into the concept that God is the most perfect being without also buying the existence of God. You know. So here again, the argument moves from just you're accepting the concept of who God is to the conclusion that you have to then buy the actual existence of God, or you're going to contradict yourself. In other words, in buying the concept that God is the being that contains all perfect qualities, you've automatically bought into God's existence if this is what is meant by possessing all perfect qualities. So, I notice you were laughing. I mean, this is a slick argument, right? And so the conclusion is that so completely does God, the supremely perfect being exists that God cannot even be thought of as not existing, much in the same way that we can't think of a triangle without thinking of it as having three angles. We can't think of God as the supremely perfect being without thinking of God as existing. Now, you can summarize this argument in a very simple statement of it. God has all perfections, or all perfect qualities. Existence is a perfection, a perfect quality, therefore God exists. Now this should tell you a lot about the argument, that it really turns on the assumption that God is a perfection, a perfect quality of a thing, something that we can say a thing has. When we say that something possesses a quality, like if we say, well, that board over there is rectangular, or that board over there is white in color, logicians say we're predicating those qualities of that thing. Like we're predicating whiteness of the board over there, or we're predicating rectangularity of it, right? If I said those chairs you're sitting on are blue, we're predicating that property of the chairs. This is what we mean by saying something is a logical predicate. So those properties, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient. Those are qualities that we can predicate of God. The question is existence in the same category? Is it a logical property, a logical predicate? What Immanuel Kant said is no. Now, Kant believed in God. He was in the Lutheran Protestant tradition, but again, he didn't think that Descartes' version of the ontological argument worked, because it has existence functioning as just another one of God's qualities. I took the bus today. My car is parked out in front of my house. It's getting old now. It's 2005 Chevy Aveo. It's blue. It has a 4-cylinder engine. It exists. It has an automatic transmission. It has 4 doors. It has a trunk. You're going to say, wait. Back up for a second, Professor Morawski. You said your car has an automatic transmission and 4 doors, and it exists. Like it's existing is just like being blue or having 4 doors. You're making existence a logical predicate. But is that the way existence functions? What Immanuel Kant says is existence, the existence of a thing, is not a logical predicate. It's not a quality that a thing has. It's a condition that has to be met in order for a thing to have any qualities. In other words, if my car did not exist, it wouldn't be blue, it wouldn't have a 4-cylinder engine, it wouldn't have 4 doors, it wouldn't have any of those qualities. But existence is not a quality. Well, let me get to the bottom line of this is that, again, a car has to exist to have any qualities. I say, so Kant says we can describe a thing with all its qualities and then afterwards decide whether what we describe either exists or does not exist. But existence is not a quality in the list. You know, in other words, there's no contradiction in saying there's no red sports car in this slide. Likewise, Descartes is right. If we think of a triangle, we have to think of it as having 3 sides and 3 angles. But we can completely deny the existence, and Kant says we deny it with all of its properties. And likewise, Kant thought, in other words, it's putting existence in the list of God's qualities that lands you into contradictions by buying the concept of God as having all perfections and then denying God's existence. But Kant says if you take existence out of the list of God's properties, then you can affirm or deny God's existence. You can do either without contradicting yourself. You know, and this basically is the way that contemporary logic treats existence. You know, and so contemporary logicians agree that Kant was right here. Now, there's a more sophisticated proof that I'm not going to mention right now. We may talk about next time. But at any rate, that's the ontological argument. This is one of the hardest arguments we're going to deal with in the whole course. But see what you think of it. If it kind of went by you, look over the slides again and think about it. And a good way to sort of test yourself is try to figure out how it produces a contradiction to buy the concept of God that the argument is working with, either Anselm's or Descartes', and then deny God's existence. And if you can see how you contradict yourself, then you understand the argument pretty well. Okay. Thanks a lot. If you missed the roll, it's up here. We're going to go on to Aquinas next time. Thank you very much for coming out.